The scorched earth of El Paso territory stretched endlessly before Henry Anderson as he guided his wagon through the unforgiving desert. The year was 1876, and like many settlers seeking fortune in the West, he had left everything behind in Missouri to stake his claim. But Henry was different. He didn't chase gold or silver. He sought something far more precious: redemption. The memories of his family's deaths during a cholera outbreak still haunted him, driving him ever westward, as if distance alone could dull the pain. The cruel summer sun beat down mercilessly as his wagon wheels cut fresh tracks through virgin sand. His two horses, steady beasts named Storm and Thunder, pressed forward despite the oppressive heat. Henry had chosen this desolate route deliberately, avoiding the main trails where bandits preyed on travelers. But as the afternoon wore on, he began to question his decision as the landscape grew increasingly alien and hostile. A peculiar sight caught his attention: what appeared to be a human figure slumped against a sun-bleached boulder. Henry's first instinct was to keep moving. Too many travelers had been lured into traps by such scenes. But something about the figure's stillness, the way it hadn't moved despite his approach, sparked his conscience. He couldn't leave another soul to die in this merciless wasteland, not after failing to save his own family. Drawing closer, Henry saw it was an elderly Apache man, his weathered face lined with years of wisdom. The man's unseeing eyes told the story. He was blind, and from the empty water skin beside him dying of thirst. Despite the warnings he'd heard about avoiding contact with natives, Henry couldn't ignore the human being before him. He brought water to the man's cracked lips, supporting his head as he drank. The old man spoke in broken English, introducing himself as Walking Thunder. He explained he had been separated from his people during a sandstorm 3 days prior. His blindness, a recent affliction, had left him unable to find his way back. As Henry tended to him, Walking Thunder's words grew stronger, took on an almost mystical quality that sent shivers down Henry's spine despite the desert heat. "You have a warrior's heart and a farmer's body," Walking Thunder said, his unseeing eyes somehow fixing directly on Henry. "The spirits have led you here, pale brother. Your kindness will not go unrewarded." Before Henry could respond, the old man began chanting in his native tongue, his hands weaving intricate patterns in the air. The very atmosphere seemed to thicken with unseen power. Just then, hoofbeats thundered across the hardpan. 3 riders approached, led by a man Henry would come to know as Frank Moore, the most feared outlaw in the territory. Moore's reputation for cruelty was legendary, especially toward natives. His gang had been terrorizing settlements across the frontier, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. Frank Moore's cold eyes took in the scene, the settler helping an Apache, and his face twisted with disgust. "Well, boys, looks like we got ourselves an Indian lover," he sneered, drawing his revolver. "Reckon we ought to teach him what happens to folks who help these savages." But as Moore aimed his weapon, something extraordinary happened. Henry felt a surge of power course through his body, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. When Moore pulled the trigger, Henry moved with impossible speed, pushing Walking Thunder to safety while simultaneously charging forward. The bullet struck his shoulder but felt no worse than a bee sting. Before anyone could react, Henry had crossed the distance to Moore's horse and yanked the outlaw from his saddle with strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself. The other 2 riders opened fire, but their bullets seemed to barely graze Henry's skin. He threw Frank Moore into them with such force that all 3 crashed to the ground in a tangled heap. Their horses, spooked by the supernatural display, bolted into the desert. The outlaws scrambled to their feet and fled in terror, leaving their leader unconscious in the dust. When Henry turned back to Walking Thunder, the old man was smiling. "The blessing is complete," he said. "The spirits have granted you the strength of the mountain lion, the speed of the desert wind, and the resilience of the ancient stones. Use these gifts wisely, for they come with a price. You must become a protector of these lands, a guardian against those who would destroy the balance." Before Henry could process what had happened, Walking Thunder's people appeared as if from nowhere, materializing from the heat waves on the horizon. They had been searching for their elder and arrived just in time to witness the extraordinary events. The Apache treated Henry not with suspicion but with reverence, recognizing that he had been touched by powerful medicine. As Walking Thunder was led away by his people, he left Henry with a final warning. "Frank Moore will return, pale brother. He will bring others, many others, for men like him cannot abide being humbled. But you are ready now. This is your true purpose, the reason the spirits guided you here." With those words, the Apache disappeared into the shimmering desert, leaving Henry to contemplate his new destiny. That night, camping beneath the stars, Henry tested his newfound abilities. He lifted his wagon with one hand, ran faster than his horses, and found that small cuts and bruises healed almost instantly. But with these gifts came responsibility, and he knew his life would never be the same. The frontier had changed him in ways he never could have imagined, and his journey was just beginning. The following days brought an unsettling quiet to the desert as Henry made his way toward Dodge City. He knew Frank Moore's type well enough, a man who would gather fellow outlaws and return with vengeance in mind. The thought didn't frighten Henry as it once might have, but the responsibility of his new powers weighed heavily. Each morning he woke to find his strength had not diminished, the blessing of walking thunder remaining as constant as the rising sun. In Dodge City, Henry found the town transformed by rumors of his encounter. Some spoke of dark magic, others of divine intervention, but most simply shook their heads in disbelief at tales of a man who could lift a wagon single-handedly. He took a room at the boarding house run by Martha, a widow whose kind eyes couldn't hide her wariness of this strange newcomer. Her daughter Rachel, however, showed no such reservation, peppering Henry with questions about his travels. Word reached Henry through Daniel, a weather-beaten ranch hand, that Frank Moore had been seen in El Paso, gathering a crew of the meanest outlaws this side of the territory. Among them was Charlie, a notorious tracker known for his ability to find anyone, anywhere in the vast desert expanse. The news should have worried Henry, but instead, it brought clarity. He would not run or hide. This was, as Walking Thunder had said, his purpose. While waiting for the inevitable confrontation, Henry helped the townspeople with tasks that would have required several men. He assisted Robert, the local blacksmith, in moving his forge to a new location, amazing onlookers by carrying the massive anvil as if it were made of cotton. The physical acts were easy. It was the attention that proved challenging. Henry had never sought to be remarkable, and now he could not avoid it. Laura, the schoolteacher, began documenting Henry's feats in her journal, believing she was witnessing something historic. She approached her observations with scholarly dedication, noting how his abilities seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Henry allowed her studies, understanding that someone should record these events, though he insisted she keep certain details private. The desert winds brought more than just dust to Dodge City. Travelers arrived with stories of Frank Moore's growing gang, now numbering 15 hardened men. They had left a trail of violence from El Paso to Cheyenne, each act seemingly calculated to draw Henry out. But Henry remained patient, knowing that rushing to confront them would only endanger innocent lives. Susan, the telegraph operator, became Henry's eyes and ears, sharing coded messages from other stations about Moore's movements. She recognized the gravity of the situation and kept Henry informed while maintaining discretion. Through her network, they learned that Moore had acquired a cache of weapons from Deadwood, including a Gatling gun, a clear sign he intended to bring overwhelming force. During this time, Henry discovered new aspects of his abilities. Not only was he stronger and faster, but his senses had sharpened remarkably. He could hear conversations from impossible distances, spot a rider on the horizon before anyone else, and sense danger like a wild animal. These gifts would prove essential in the coming conflict, but they also isolated him further from normal human experience. Margaret, the town's healer, became one of Henry's few confidants. She had treated Walking Thunder years ago and understood something of Apache medicine. She helped Henry understand that his powers were not just physical but connected to the very spirit of the land. "The desert chose you," she would say, "because you chose to help one of its own without thought of reward." As summer turned to fall, the tension in Dodge City grew palpable. Children were kept closer to home, businesses closed earlier, and armed men patrolled the streets at night. Henry knew the waiting would soon end. Frank Moore was too proud, too angry to delay much longer. The blessing Henry had received would face its first true test, and the consequences would reshape more than just his own destiny. The night before Moore's gang was spotted approaching from the south, Henry sat alone on the boarding house porch watching the stars wheel overhead. He thought of Walking Thunder's words about purpose and destiny. Tomorrow would prove whether he was worthy of the old man's gift, whether he could be the protector this harsh frontier needed. As he contemplated what lay ahead, Henry realized that strength alone would not be enough. He would need wisdom to use his power justly. The scorching El Paso sun beat down mercilessly as Henry Anderson made his way through the crowded marketplace, his newfound strength still feeling foreign in his muscles. 2 weeks had passed since his encounter with the blind Apache elder, and already tales of his extraordinary feats had begun spreading through town like wildfire. He'd lifted a fully loaded wagon single-handedly to free a trapped child, and somehow tossed a charging bull clear over a fence with barely any effort. The townspeople regarded him with a mixture of awe and suspicion now. Frank Moore, the local banker, watched Henry from the shadowed doorway of his establishment with calculating eyes. Moore had been losing his iron grip on El Paso's businesses ever since Henry started helping struggling farmers transport impossible loads and assist with backbreaking work that usually required multiple men. The banker's monopoly on lending for hired labor was crumbling, and his face had grown increasingly sour with each passing day. The unusual blessing had come with an equally unusual price. Henry could feel the old Apache's presence in his dreams, showing him visions of impending danger. Last night's dream had been particularly vivid. He'd seen Frank Moore speaking in hushed tones with a group of rough-looking men, passing them bags of coins in a dimly lit room. The dream had ended with flames consuming the modest homestead where Daniel Clark, Henry's closest friend, lived with his wife Rachel. Rachel Clark had been like a sister to Henry since childhood, and Daniel had become a brother to him in the years since their marriage. The couple had taken Henry in when he first arrived in El Paso with nothing but the clothes on his back, helping him establish himself as a carpenter. Now, as he hurried through the dusty streets toward their home on the outskirts of town, his heart pounded with growing dread. The smell of smoke reached Henry's nostrils before he cleared the last row of buildings. His enhanced strength surged through his limbs as he broke into a sprint, covering ground with impossible speed. The Clark homestead came into view, and his worst fears were confirmed. Flames were already licking up the sides of the wooden structure. Through the thick smoke, he could make out several mounted figures galloping away to the north. Inside the burning house, he found Daniel unconscious near the door, a nasty gash across his forehead. Using his supernatural strength, Henry easily hoisted his friend over one shoulder, but Rachel was nowhere to be found. As he carried Daniel to safety, he spotted a piece of paper nailed to a fence post. The message was simple but chilling. Walker Ranch. Midnight. Come alone or the woman dies. The name Walker sent a cold shiver down Henry's spine. Robert Walker was notorious as the most dangerous gunman in the territory. In town, Henry left Daniel in the care of Martha Taylor, the local healer, before heading to the livery stable. The stable boy, Charlie Anderson, no relation, was watching him with wide eyes as he saddled his horse. "Mr. Henry," the boy ventured nervously, "them men who rode out earlier, they was talking about the old Apache burial grounds up near Walker Ranch, said something about a ceremony at midnight." The pieces began falling into place in Henry's mind. Frank Moore must have learned about the source of his strength and figured out how to corrupt the Apache magic for his own purposes. The banker had always been obsessed with power, and now he was dabbling in forces he couldn't possibly understand. Rachel wasn't just a hostage. She was going to be a sacrifice in whatever dark ritual Moore had planned. With his enhanced abilities, Henry could have made it to Walker Ranch in a fraction of the time on foot, but he needed his horse for what was to come. He'd seen enough in his dreams to know that Moore's scheme involved more than just mortal men. The blind Apache's gift hadn't just been about physical strength. It had awakened something deeper in Henry, a connection to the spiritual world that he was only beginning to understand. As he rode out of town, he could feel ancient powers stirring in the desert around him. Susan Moore, Frank's wife, caught Henry just as he was leaving. Her face was etched with worry as she pressed a small leather pouch into his hand. "My husband's lost his mind," she whispered. "He found these in the old Apache's cave after you saved him. They're supposed to be sacred crystals. Whatever he's planning tonight, these are part of it. Please, stop him before he destroys himself and everyone else." Henry tucked the pouch into his shirt, knowing these small stones might mean the difference between life and death when midnight came. The desert wind picked up as Henry guided his horse through narrow canyons, the sacred pouch pressing against his chest like a burning coal. The setting sun painted the rocks in shades of blood and gold, and Henry could feel the crystals humming with an energy that made his enhanced strength surge and pulse. His connection to the spiritual realm had grown stronger since saving the blind Apache, and now the very landscape seemed to whisper ancient warnings that made his horse's ears twitch nervously. As he rounded a bend, he spotted three riders ahead. Frank Moore's hired guns from El Paso, led by the notorious Charlie Webb. They were gathered around something that made Henry's blood run cold. The remains of an ancient medicine wheel, its carefully arranged stones scattered and defiled. The men were methodically destroying the sacred site, following Moore's instructions to break whatever power remained in these old places. Henry's gift allowed him to see the shimmering threads of energy they were severing, like golden strands being cut one by one. The confrontation was inevitable. Charlie spotted him first, his weathered face splitting into a cruel grin as he drew his revolver. "Moore said you might show up, Henry. Said you got yourself some Indian magic." The other two men spread out, trying to flank him. Henry could feel the strength flowing through his muscles, but he knew bullets could still kill him, magic or not. He needed to be smart about this. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Charlie fired, Henry felt the blind Apache's power surge through him. He rolled from his saddle with impossible speed, the bullet whistling harmlessly overhead. His enhanced strength let him flip a massive boulder for cover, something that should have taken 3 men to budge. The hired gun's horses reared in panic, sensing the supernatural energy crackling around them. During the chaos, Daniel, the youngest of Charlie's men, tried to make a break for it. His horse bolted straight through the medicine wheel's remnants, and suddenly the air itself seemed to tear open. A vortex of sand and ancient power swept him up, horse and all, before dropping them hard enough to crack ribs. The remaining gunman, Robert, threw down his weapon and fled into the gathering darkness, leaving Charlie to face Henry alone. The final confrontation was brief but intense. Charlie emptied his gun at Henry, who moved with preternatural grace, closing the distance between them like a mountain lion. When he reached the gunman, Henry didn't even need to throw a punch. He simply grabbed Charlie's arm and squeezed, his blessed strength causing the bones to crack like dry twigs. Charlie's scream echoed off the canyon walls as he crumpled to the ground. Searching Charlie's saddlebags, Henry found what he was looking for: a detailed map marked with locations of other sacred sites throughout the territory. Moore wasn't just planning to destroy one medicine wheel. He was systematically targeting every ancient power point between Dodge City and El Paso. The madman believed that by breaking these sacred places, he could harness their energy for himself. As Henry bound Charlie's wrists and prepared to take him back to town, he felt the crystals in Susan's pouch grow warm again. Holding one up to the last rays of sunlight, he saw images flash across its surface. Moore at an ancient burial ground near Deadwood, surrounded by dark figures that weren't quite human. The blind Apache's gift was showing him more than just physical threats now. It was revealing the supernatural forces Moore had awakened. Night was falling fast, and Henry knew he had to make a choice. Take Charlie back to face justice in town, or follow the map immediately to stop Moore's desecration of the next site. The crystals pulsed again, and this time Henry saw Susan's face, tears streaming down her cheeks as she stood in Moore's empty house, reading a letter that made her hands shake. Whatever her husband had planned for tonight, it was already in motion, and time was running out. Loading Charlie onto his horse, Henry pointed them toward town. He'd drop off his prisoner, warn Susan about what he'd discovered, and then ride hard for Deadwood. The blind Apache's blessing hadn't just given him strength. It had made him a guardian of something ancient and powerful. As stars began appearing in the desert sky, Henry could feel both worlds watching him, waiting to see if one man's gift would be enough to stop the darkness that Frank Moore had unleashed. The moon cast long shadows across the desert scrub as Henry's horse thundered toward town. The unconscious Charlie slumped forward in the saddle ahead of him. Each crystal pulse grew stronger, like a heartbeat warning of impending danger. The ancient power that flowed through Henry's veins since the blind Apache's blessing seemed to resonate with something dark awakening in the distance, a corruption of the sacred forces he'd sworn to protect. As they approached the outskirts of Dodge City, lantern light flickered in windows and dogs began barking at their approach. The sheriff's office sat dark and empty, but Henry spotted Deputy Daniel reading on the porch of the boarding house across the street. The young lawman jumped to his feet when he recognized the riders, his hand instinctively moving to his holster until Henry called out. "Found this one out by Moore's dig site," Henry explained as Daniel helped him lower Charlie's limp form. He'll need a cell and a doctor, and keep him under close watch. Moore's got him mixed up in something dangerous. The harsh desert wind howled through the narrow canyon as Henry Anderson crouched behind a weathered boulder, his newfound strength coursing through his veins like liquid fire. 3 months had passed since he'd saved the blind Apache elder and received his mysterious blessing, but now that power would face its greatest test. Below him, Frank Moore's gang had taken over the small trading post outside El Paso, holding Martha Clark and her young daughter Rachel hostage while demanding the sacred Apache artifacts Henry had sworn to protect. The sun beat mercilessly upon the red rocks as Henry studied the scene through his brass spyglass. 4 armed men patrolled the wooden stockade, while Moore himself paced the trading post's porch, occasionally pausing to peer into the distance. Henry's enhanced vision could make out every detail of the outlaw's scarred face. The same face that had haunted his dreams since that bloody night in Dodge City when Moore's gang had murdered Daniel Walker, Henry's closest friend and Martha's husband. Inside the trading post, Martha Clark fought to keep her composure as she comforted Rachel, who had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. The past 2 days of captivity had taken their toll, but Martha refused to give in to despair. She had recognized something different in Henry Anderson's eyes when he'd last visited. A strange, almost supernatural gleam that reminded her of the stories Daniel used to tell about mystical Apache blessings. Now she clung to the hope that whatever power Henry possessed would be enough to save them. Frank Moore's patience was wearing thin as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the desert floor. He'd expected Anderson to have shown up by now, driven by his predictably noble nature to attempt a rescue, but Moore had underestimated how much his old rival had changed. The Henry Anderson he'd known in Dodge City would have charged in recklessly at the first opportunity. This new version was displaying an unsettling patience that made Moore increasingly uneasy. The first sign of Henry's attack came not as gunfire, but as an otherworldly howl that echoed through the canyon walls, causing Moore's men to freeze in their tracks. Charlie Taylor, the youngest of the gang, swore he saw a massive shadow pass overhead, though the sky remained empty save for a few circling vultures. The horses in the corral began to stamp and whinny nervously, picking up on an energy that human senses could barely detect. With lightning speed that no ordinary man could match, Henry burst from his hiding place and covered the 100 yards to the stockade in mere seconds. The first 2 guards barely had time to raise their weapons before he was upon them, disarming them with precise strikes that left them unconscious but alive. Henry had promised the Apache elder he would not take life unnecessarily, and he intended to keep that vow even in the heat of battle. Inside the trading post, Martha heard the commotion and pulled Rachel closer, whispering prayers into her daughter's hair. Through the window, she caught glimpses of impossible movement. Henry Anderson moving faster than any human should be able to, his actions fluid and precise as he systematically dismantled Moore's defenses. The remaining guards fired wildly, their bullets seeming to pass harmlessly through the space where Henry had been moments before. Frank Moore's composure finally cracked as he watched his carefully laid trap fall apart. He grabbed Martha and Rachel, dragging them onto the porch to use as shields. "Anderson!" he bellowed into the chaos. "Show yourself or I'll send them to join Daniel." But even as the words left his mouth, Moore felt an unnatural chill run down his spine. The air around him seemed to thicken, and time itself appeared to slow. The confrontation that followed would be whispered about in saloons across the territory for years to come. Witnesses would swear they saw Henry Anderson move like a spirit, passing through solid walls and shrugging off bullets as if they were raindrops. But what truly struck fear into Moore's heart was the look in his enemy's eyes. Not hatred or rage, but a calm, almost serene determination backed by power beyond mortal understanding. With a single fluid motion, Henry disarmed Moore and freed the hostages, his enhanced strength allowing him to move both Martha and Rachel to safety before Moore could even react. The outlaw found himself alone on the porch, facing an opponent who seemed more force of nature than man. Henry said softly, "The Apache elder showed me true strength comes from protecting life, not taking it. Your fate isn't mine to decide. The law will handle that." As if summoned by his words, a patrol of Texas Rangers appeared on the horizon, led by Robert Clark, Martha's brother. They found Frank Moore and his surviving men bound and subdued, with Henry Anderson standing watch as Martha and Rachel embraced their rescuers. The Rangers were puzzled by the strange marks left in the dust, signs of movement too fast to follow, and impressions that seemed to defy natural law. That evening, as the desert sky painted itself in brilliant oranges and purples, Henry sat with Martha and Rachel on the trading post's porch. No one spoke of the impossible things they'd witnessed, but a new understanding passed between them. Martha's hand found Henry's, and in that touch was the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. The blessing of strength had given Henry the power to save lives, but it was the power of love that would truly heal their wounded hearts. The Texas Rangers' arrival brought a momentary peace, but Henry knew Frank Moore's capture wouldn't end their troubles. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trading post's weathered boards, Robert Clark pulled Henry aside with grave news. Other members of Moore's gang had been spotted heading toward Deadwood, where they'd reportedly joined forces with a notorious outlaw band. The blessed strength flowing through Henry's veins told him his journey wasn't over. There were still innocents who needed protection. Martha insisted on accompanying Henry northward, her determination matching the steel in her eyes. Rachel chose to remain at the trading post with Robert and his rangers, helping to coordinate communications between law enforcement outposts. The parting was bittersweet, but they all understood the gravity of what lay ahead. Before leaving, Henry visited Frank Moore in his cell, seeking answers about his gang's true motives. The defeated man spoke of ancient Apache treasures and sacred grounds, revelations that made Henry's supernatural gift seem even more significant. The journey to Deadwood took them through harsh terrain, where the desert gradually gave way to rugged foothills. Henry and Martha traveled light, but their bond grew heavier with meaning with each passing mile. At night, beside small campfires, Martha shared stories of her childhood with Robert, of times before violence had scarred their lives. Henry spoke of the blind Apache wise man, finally revealing the full truth of his blessing and the responsibility it carried. In a small settlement 3 days from Deadwood, they encountered Daniel, a former ranger-turned-scout who'd been tracking Moore's remaining men. His intelligence painted a disturbing picture. The outlaws weren't just after money anymore. They sought something specific in the Apache territories, something connected to the same spiritual powers that had blessed Henry. The pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place, each revelation more unsettling than the last. The closer they got to Deadwood, the more Henry felt his enhanced strength pulsing with unusual intensity. Martha noticed him growing more contemplative, wrestling with the weight of his gift and its purpose. She reminded him that strength wasn't just in his muscles, it was in his heart, in his choices, in the way he used his abilities to protect others. Their conversations during those long rides helped Henry understand that the blessing wasn't just about physical power, it was about the wisdom to use it justly. Deadwood greeted them with its characteristic chaos, a bustling maze of miners, gamblers, and desperate souls seeking fortune. But beneath the surface energy, Henry sensed a tension in the air. Moore's men had left their mark here too, spreading whispers about ancient powers and lost treasures. In the town's crowded saloon, Martha's quick thinking and Henry's imposing presence helped them gather crucial information about their quarry's plans. They learned that the outlaws were planning something at an old Apache burial ground in the hills outside town. The site was considered sacred, and disturbing it would be more than just a crime. It would be a desecration of the very powers that had granted Henry his gift. The revelation struck him like a physical blow, and he finally understood why the blind wise man had chosen him. This wasn't just about stopping criminals. It was about protecting something far more precious. As they prepared for the confrontation ahead, Martha and Henry were joined by unexpected allies. Local Apache traders, hearing of Henry's blessing and his mission, offered their guidance. They spoke of ancient prophecies about a chosen protector, making Henry uncomfortable with the weight of destiny. But Martha's steady presence kept him grounded, reminding him that prophecies were fulfilled one choice at a time, one right action after another. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would test not just Henry's supernatural strength, but the very nature of justice and redemption in a land where such concepts often came at the point of a gun. As they made their preparations, Henry felt the desert wind carrying echoes of the blind wise man's words, reminding him that true strength lay in how one used their gifts, not in the gifts themselves. The scorching desert sun cast long shadows across the Cheyenne Valley as Henry Anderson stood before the weathered Apache elder, his heart heavy with the weight of destiny. The blind wise man's prophecy of extraordinary strength had manifested fully within him, yet this power had brought both blessing and curse. As he faced the murderous Frank Taylor and his gang, who had terrorized the region, Henry knew his gift would be tested like never before. Frank Taylor's men had surrounded the small homestead where Henry had sheltered Robert Clark's family. Good people who'd taken him in after his long journey. The gang's torches flickered menacingly in the gathering dusk, their intentions clear as death. But Henry felt no fear, only a deep resolve born from the ancient blessing that flowed through his veins. Margaret Clark clutched her children close as she watched Henry stride purposefully toward the armed men. She'd witnessed his incredible feats over the past months, lifting impossible weights, bending iron with his bare hands. Yet she worried this gift would lead him to overconfidence against such ruthless opponents. Her husband Robert stood at the window, rifle ready, though they both knew Henry had insisted on facing this alone. The confrontation began with Frank Taylor's sneering challenge, but his mocking smile faltered as Henry calmly approached through the hail of bullets. The Apache's blessing made his skin like rawhide. The shots that struck him fell harmlessly away. The gang's expressions turned from derision to terror as Henry demonstrated the full scope of his supernatural strength. In a display that would become legend, Henry scattered Frank's men like leaves in a storm. He hurled grown men through the air, crushed their weapons like paper, moved faster than seemed humanly possible. Yet even in his fury, he showed mercy, disabling rather than killing. Honoring the wise man's teaching that great power demands great restraint, Frank Taylor himself proved a more formidable opponent, drawing on dark powers of his own. Forbidden magic stolen from sacred sites he desecrated. The two men clashed in an epic struggle that shook the very ground, Henry's blessed strength against Frank's stolen sorcery. Their battle raged across the homestead as storm clouds gathered overhead. Susan Moore, the local healer who had helped tend the blind Apache elder, arrived during the fight's climax. She recognized the corrupted artifacts Frank wielded and called out their weaknesses to Henry. Her knowledge, combined with Henry's power, finally gave him the advantage he needed. With a mighty blow, he shattered Frank's totems and broke his dark influence forever. In the aftermath, as Frank and his surviving men were led away by the sheriff, Henry reflected on how his journey had changed him. The blind Apache's gift had taught him that true strength lay not in raw power, but in how one chose to use it. The Clark family embraced him as one of their own, and Susan's knowing smile suggested romance might bloom. The desert winds whispered of other challenges to come, more who would test themselves against the man blessed with extraordinary strength. But Henry knew now that his gift was meant not for personal glory, but to protect those who needed it most. He had found his true home among these good people, and his strength would always serve their cause. As the story of Henry's victory spread, others touched by supernatural forces began emerging from the shadows. Some sought his guidance, others his challenge. The blind Apache elder's blessing had set in motion events that would reshape the frontier, as magic and myth wove themselves into the fabric of the changing West. Henry Anderson's legend was just beginning, and the desert held many more secrets yet to be revealed. Years later, children would gather around fires to hear tales of the mighty Henry Anderson, blessed protector of Cheyenne Valley. They'd learn how true strength came not from power itself, but from the wisdom to use it justly. The blind Apache elder's gift had transformed not just one man, but an entire region's understanding of power, justice, and the mystical forces that shaped their world. The story became deeply woven into local folklore, though few knew the full truth of that fateful day when Henry first saved the wise man's life. The Clark family maintained their close friendship with Henry, their homestead becoming a sanctuary for others seeking guidance in troubled times. And on quiet nights, Henry would sit with Susan under the stars, sharing secrets of power both blessed and cursed. As Cheyenne grew from frontier outpost to thriving town, Henry remained its silent guardian, using his strength not just to protect, but to build and nurture the community. The Apache elder's prophecy had spoken not only of physical power, but of the strength to unite people across the divisions of race and culture. Henry's legacy would endure long after the last gunshot faded from the frontier. As autumn painted the desert in muted golds and purples, Henry found himself reflecting on the decades that had passed since that fateful encounter with the blind Apache elder. The gift of strength had brought both blessing and burden, shaping not only his life but the very fabric of the frontier. Now, as Cheyenne prospered and the wild edges of the territory grew tamer, he felt the weight of time and change pressing upon him. Susan, Her hair now streaked with silver but her spirit undimmed had become his anchor through the years. Their partnership had weathered countless storms, from range wars to the changing times that threatened to sweep away the old ways. Together, they had built more than just a life. They had created a legacy of justice and compassion that reached far beyond their homestead's boundaries. The Clark family's ranch had grown into a symbol of unity, where cowboys and Native Americans alike found common ground. Henry's extraordinary abilities, once a source of whispered rumors and fear, had become accepted as part of the region's mystical heritage. Children would gather around campfires to hear tales of the strong man who could lift a wagon with one hand but chose to build bridges between peoples instead. One crisp morning, word reached Henry that the old Apache elder had passed into the spirit world. The news struck him deeply, and he rode out alone into the desert, seeking the sacred place where their paths had first crossed. The landscape had changed little. The same ancient rocks stood sentinel. The same wind whispered secrets across the sand. Here, Henry finally understood the full meaning of the elder's gift. In the following days, strangers began arriving in Cheyenne, drawn by some inexplicable force. Among them were others who had been touched by the elder's wisdom. A woman who could heal with a touch. A man who could read the thoughts of animals. They gathered at Henry's homestead, sharing stories of how their gifts had shaped their lives and the responsibilities they carried. The gathering became a council of sorts, where the gifted ones spoke of a growing darkness in the territory. Raiders were pushing north from El Paso, led by a man who possessed dark powers. Powers that seemed to be the mirror opposite of the elder's blessings. Henry realized that his strength would be needed one final time, not for vengeance or personal glory, but to protect the delicate balance between the old world and the new. Susan insisted on accompanying him as he prepared for this last journey. She understood, better than anyone, that this was not merely a physical battle, but a spiritual reckoning. The Clark family rallied around them, offering support and wisdom gained through years of friendship. Even old Frank, now stooped with age but sharp as ever, contributed his knowledge of the territory's hidden paths. As they rode south, Henry and his allies encountered others who had been affected by the elder's passing. Both those who celebrated his wisdom and those who feared the change his teachings had brought. The landscape itself seemed to respond to their passage, with dust devils dancing in their wake and hawks circling overhead as if offering guidance. The final confrontation took place in a forgotten canyon, where ancient petroglyphs told stories of power, both light and dark. Henry faced his adversary not with fists or firearms, but with the deeper strength the elder had truly blessed him with. The power to understand, to forgive, and to heal. The Dark One's powers, born of hatred and fear, could not withstand the force of compassion and unity that Henry had spent a lifetime cultivating. In the aftermath, as the dust settled and the wind carried away the last echoes of conflict, Henry realized that his greatest strength had never been in his muscles, but in his heart. The blind Apache elder's final gift had been this understanding: that true power lies not in domination but in the ability to bring people together, to build rather than destroy, to love rather than hate. The journey back to Cheyenne was marked by celebration rather than triumph. Communities along the way opened their doors, sharing meals and stories, weaving new threads into the tapestry of frontier legend. Susan rode beside Henry, their love deeper for having faced this last challenge together. The Clark family welcomed them home with embraces that spoke louder than words. As the years rolled on, Henry's extraordinary physical strength gradually faded, but his true legacy only grew stronger. The homestead became a place of learning, where people of all backgrounds came to understand the wisdom of the blind Apache elder. And in the quiet evenings, as the desert stars wheeled overhead, Henry would share with young visitors the most important lesson he had learned: that the greatest strength lies not in what we can take from the world, but in what we can give to it.